There was handwriting on the back, a date, and beneath it, one sentence. I read it twice. It was about a child who had been brought to the community center 20 years earlier. I didn't understand the meaning at first, then I noticed the girl's name. It was my name. I stood completely still for several seconds. I couldn't even think. There were many people in the world who shared my name. I knew that it could have been a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence, but the photograph was taken 20 years earlier, and the girl looked approximately the age I had been at the time. I took the photograph home. That night, I searched through my old family albums. I had always known that my childhood photographs were incomplete. My mother had never been interested in keeping many pictures, and after she passed away, I had never had the courage to go through everything properly. I opened one old album after another, then I found something, a photograph of me as a child. I was wearing a yellow sweater. My hair was tied back. The photograph had been taken in front of our old apartment building. I compared it with the photograph from the community center. The little girl was wearing the same yellow sweater, the same hairstyle, the same small birthmark near her left eyebrow. It was me. There was no doubt. I had been at that community center 20 years earlier, but I had no memory of it. The next morning, I almost didn't take the bus. I considered staying home. I considered throwing the photograph away. Instead, I went. The woman was already sitting in her usual seat. She looked at me when I entered. For the first time, her eyes met mine for more than a second. There was something in her expression that I couldn't understand. Not fear, not surprise, something closer to recognition. I sat down. Neither of us said anything. The bus continued through the familiar streets, but everything felt different now. When we reached the old neighborhood, the woman stood up. She walked toward the door. Before getting off, she turned around and looked at me one more time. Then she left. I followed her. Several minutes later, the community center was still closed, but beside the entrance was a narrow side door. It had a small window. Through the glass, I could see a room filled with old furniture and cardboard boxes. There was also a notice on the door. The building was scheduled to be renovated. The renovation would begin in less than 2 weeks. That explained why the woman had suddenly returned after all those years. She wasn't simply visiting the building. She was trying to retrieve something before it disappeared. I went home and searched through everything I had from my childhood, old school papers, medical records, birthday cards, photographs, and then I found an envelope hidden inside a box. It had my mother's handwriting on it. Inside was a document from 20 years earlier. It was connected to the community center, and as I read it, I finally understood why my mother had never told me about that place. I also understood why the woman on the bus had spent years returning there. She hadn't been watching the building because she missed it. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell me something about my own childhood, something my mother had taken to her grave. And the most disturbing part was that the document suggested the woman hadn't simply known me 20 years ago. She had been responsible for something that changed my entire childhood. I folded the paper carefully. Then I looked at the photograph again. For the first time, I noticed that the woman in the picture wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking directly at me, and suddenly, I wanted to know exactly what had happened that day. The document I found in my mother's old box was only 1 page long, but it changed the way I remembered my childhood. It confirmed that I had spent several weeks at the community center when I was a little girl. According to the document, my mother had been going through a difficult period and had temporarily placed me in the care of the community center's children's program. I had apparently stayed there during the summer. The woman from the bus had worked there. Her name was Margaret. I had never heard that name before, but suddenly, small pieces of my childhood began coming back. A yellow room, a wooden table covered with crayons, a garden behind a brick building, the smell of old books, and a woman who used to sit beside me whenever I became upset. I couldn't remember her face clearly, but I remembered feeling safe around her. I spent the entire evening looking through the old papers. Then I found another photograph. This one was much smaller. It showed Margaret sitting beside me in the garden. On the back, my mother had written a date. It was the same date written on the photograph I had found beneath the planter. I finally understood why Margaret had been returning to the building. She wasn't following me. She had been waiting for me to remember. The next morning, I took the bus again. Margaret was in her usual seat. This time, I sat beside her. I placed the photograph and the document on my lap. She looked at them. Then she looked at me. There was no surprise on her face, only relief. She reached into her handbag and removed the old notebook I had seen weeks earlier. She opened it carefully. Inside were pages of handwritten notes from the summer when I had stayed at the community center. There were small observations about the children, what they liked, what frightened them, what made them laugh. And among those pages were several notes about me. One entry mentioned that I had often asked whether my mother was coming back. Another said that I had become unusually quiet during the final week. Then I found the last entry. It explained everything. 20 years earlier, my mother had planned to move away with me. She had been struggling financially and believed she had no choice. But before we left, something happened. I had become ill. Margaret had taken care of me. My mother, overwhelmed and frightened, had made a decision. She left me temporarily with Margaret while she tried to arrange a new place for us, but she never returned for several weeks. During that time, Margaret became deeply attached to me. She had no children of her own. When my mother finally returned, she wanted to take me home immediately. Margaret had worried that my mother wasn't ready to care for me. She contacted a social worker. That decision caused a painful conflict between the adults involved. Eventually, my mother was allowed to take me home, but before we left, Margaret gave her one condition. She wanted to know that I was safe. My mother agreed. For years afterward, Margaret sent letters. Most of them were returned. My mother never told me. Eventually, Margaret stopped trying, but she never forgot me. The reason she had returned to the community center so many years later was simple. She had recently learned that the building was going to be demolished. She wanted to retrieve the photographs and notes before everything disappeared. She had no idea where I lived. Then, by chance, she saw me on the bus. She recognized me immediately. I had no memory of her, but she recognized the little girl she had cared for. She began taking the same bus every morning because she wanted to see me. But she was afraid to approach me. She didn't know whether I remembered her. She didn't want to force herself into my life. So she waited. The old photograph was her way of leaving something behind without demanding anything from me. The envelope contained the last things she had kept from that summer. There were photographs, notes, and a small drawing I had made as a child. I had drawn a house with a garden. Underneath it, I had written one sentence. I wanted to go back to the garden. I cried when I read it, not because I was sad, because I suddenly realized that a small part of me had remembered Margaret all along. The following weekend, I went back to the community center. The building was almost empty. The garden behind it was overgrown, but I recognized it immediately. There was an old wooden bench near the fence. I sat there for a long time. Margaret came a few minutes later. She had brought the small notebook. We looked through it together. I didn't need to ask her about every detail. The pages answered most of my questions. I learned that she had kept every photograph because she believed that one day I might want to know where I had been during those weeks. I also learned something about my mother. She hadn't hidden the story because she didn't care about me. She had hidden it because she was ashamed of how difficult that period had been. She had been young, overwhelmed, and afraid that admitting she needed help would make her a bad mother. As I grew older, the memory became buried beneath everything that came afterward. I had remembered my childhood as lonely, but now I understood that it had also contained kindness. Someone had looked after me when my mother couldn't. Someone had remembered me when I had forgotten her. The community center was demolished a few weeks later. I went there on the final day. The old brick walls were already partly gone. The garden was disappearing too. Before I left, I took one last photograph. It was a picture of the place where I had spent those weeks as a child. Margaret stood beside me. She didn't need to say anything. Neither did I. Some stories don't need explanations spoken aloud. Sometimes they only need to be remembered. After that, I stopped taking the bus every morning. My job changed, and I found another route. But for a while, I still woke up at the same time and instinctively looked toward the window. I would remember that old bus, the familiar seats, the rainy mornings, and the quiet woman who always sat 2 rows behind the rear door. For almost a year, I had thought she was simply part of my daily routine. I had no idea she was part of my past. The strangest thing about the whole experience was that nothing dramatic had happened. There had been no crime. No dangerous secret. No unbelievable coincidence. Just two people who had known each other long ago and somehow found each other again. One of us remembered, the other had forgotten. And perhaps that was why Margaret never forced me to remember her. She simply waited. She left a photograph. She left a notebook. She left a piece of my childhood where I could find it. And when I was finally ready, the past came back on its own. I still have the photograph of the 7 people standing outside the old community center. I keep it in a drawer beside my childhood pictures. Sometimes I look at it and think about how strange life can be. We pass hundreds of people without knowing that some of them may have already been part of our story. We sit beside strangers. We share the same roads. We take the same buses. And we rarely stop to wonder who they really are. I never found out exactly how many times Margaret saw me before I noticed her. Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. But I know one thing now. Every morning, when she sat by the window and looked toward that old building, she wasn't simply remembering the past. She was waiting for someone who had forgotten her. And somehow, after 20 years, that someone finally remembered.